Paris feels like a city that has always existed, but beneath the elegant boulevards and iconic monuments lies a story of transformation that spans over 2,000 years. Tonight we'll uncover how a small Celtic settlement on an island in the Seine River grew into the world's most celebrated cultural capital. Home to nearly 11 million people, Paris has weathered invasions, revolutions, plagues and wars to become a beacon of art, literature and human achievement. We'll start with a surprising discovery beneath the modern city, and from there we'll follow the remarkable journey of this extraordinary place through the centuries. So just relax and let your mind wander as we explore the captivating history of Paris. When you think of Paris, perhaps you picture the Eiffel Tower piercing the sky, the Champs-Élysées bustling with life, or the Seine flowing gracefully beneath ancient bridges. This city feels like the very essence of European culture and sophistication. Indeed, Paris has long been considered the heart of the artistic and intellectual world. As the home of the Louvre, and with Notre Dame Cathedral rising majestically over the Ile de la Cité, there's an undeniable sense of history woven into every corner of this magnificent city. You can sense that this place has witnessed it all, every triumph and tragedy that has shaped Western civilization over the millennia. Relatively speaking, most of the architecture that defines modern Paris isn't that ancient. The Eiffel Tower was constructed in the 19th century, as were the grand boulevards that Baron Haussmann carved through the medieval streets. But the area we now call Paris has been a significant centre of human activity since long before the Romans arrived. And it's also the site of another hidden history. In the 1960s, during construction work beneath the forecourt of Notre Dame Cathedral, archaeologists made an extraordinary discovery. Ancient Celtic coins, pottery fragments, and the remains of wooden structures emerged from the earth. These artifacts revealed the existence of Luteicia, a thriving settlement that existed here over 2,000 years ago. It's remarkable to imagine that here, where tourists now gather to admire Gothic architecture, Celtic warriors once defended their island stronghold against Roman legions. However, the true story of Paris must begin with understanding why this particular location became so important to human civilization. Humans had been living in the region for thousands of years before any permanent settlement took root. There's evidence of hunter-gatherer communities along the Seine Valley dating back to the Paleolithic era. Stone tools and cave paintings suggest that early humans recognized the strategic value of this bend in the river long before anyone dreamed of building a city. During the Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, the area consisted of scattered farming communities. The fertile plains surrounding the Seine supported agriculture, while the river itself provided fish and a means of transportation. By the Iron Age, which began around 800 BCE, the Celtic tribes known as the Parisian had established themselves as the dominant group in the region. These weren't primitive people living in simple huts. The Parisians were sophisticated traders and craftsmen who understood the value of controlling river crossings and trade routes. The Parisians chose their location with remarkable strategic insight. The cluster of islands in the Seine, particularly what we now call the Ile de la Cité, provided natural defences against enemies, while allowing easy access to both banks of the river. This was the perfect spot for a fortress and trading post combined. The Celtic settlement of Luteicia occupied not just the island, but also extended onto both banks of the Seine. Archaeological evidence suggests it was a bustling community of several thousand inhabitants by the time the Romans arrived. Celtic Luteicia was far from the cultural backwater that Roman historians would later claim. The Parisians had developed their own currency, with beautifully crafted gold coins bearing intricate designs. They traded extensively with other Celtic tribes across Gaul and even maintained commercial relationships with Mediterranean civilizations. Their craftsmen produced exquisite metalwork, pottery, and textiles that were prized throughout the region. This was a society that valued art, commerce, and innovation. The Parisi also possessed a rich spiritual life centered around their connection to the natural world. The Seine itself was considered sacred, and numerous religious ceremonies took place along its banks. Sacred groves on the surrounding hills served as temples where druids conducted elaborate rituals. These early Parisians understood that their city existed at the intersection of the earthly and divine realms, a belief that would influence the city's character for centuries to come. In 52 BCE, everything changed. Julius Caesar and his Roman legions were systematically conquering Gaul, and the Parisii found themselves facing an impossible choice. They could submit to Roman rule or fight for their independence. Under the leadership of the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix, many Celtic tribes chose to resist. The Parisii joined this desperate rebellion, knowing full well that defeat would mean the end of their way of life. The siege of Luteicia was brief but devastating. Caesar's disciplined legions overwhelmed the Celtic defenders, and the city fell after only a few days of fighting. In a final act of defiance, the retreating Parisii burned their own settlement rather than allow it to fall intact into Roman hands. The smoke rising from the burning city marks the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Romans were nothing if not practical. They immediately recognized the strategic value of the site that the Parisii had chosen. Within months of their conquest, Roman engineers were drawing up plans for a new city that would serve as a regional administrative centre. They kept the name Luteicia, but everything else would be rebuilt according to Roman standards and specifications. Roman Luteicia was a marvel of ancient engineering and urban planning. The Romans constructed their new city primarily on the left bank of the Seine, in the area we now know as the Latin Quarter. They built it on a grid pattern with straight roads, proper sewers, and public baths. The heart of the city was the Forum, a grand public square surrounded by temples, shops, and government buildings. This wasn't just a military outpost, but a genuine attempt to create a miniature Rome in the heart of Gaul. The Romans also recognized the importance of entertainment in maintaining public order. They constructed an impressive amphitheatre that could seat over 15,000 spectators. The ruins of this structure, known as the Arène de Lutèce, can still be visited today. They also built elaborate public baths, complete with hot and cold pools, steam rooms, and massage areas. These weren't just places to get clean, but social centres where citizens gathered to discuss politics, conduct business, and enjoy the pleasures of Roman civilization. Perhaps most importantly, the Romans constructed an extensive aqueduct system that brought fresh water from the springs over 10 miles away. This engineering marvel allowed Luteicia to support a much larger population than would otherwise have been possible. Clean water meant better health, which meant more people could live and work in the city. The population of Roman Luteicia grew rapidly, reaching an estimated 50,000 inhabitants by the 2nd century CIE. Roman Luteicia became a true melting pot of cultures and peoples. Roman citizens, Celtic natives, Germanic merchants, and traders from across the Mediterranean world all called the city home. This diversity created a vibrant cultural atmosphere where different traditions, languages, and customs blended together. Greek philosophy was discussed in the same forums where Celtic druids once held sway. Roman gods shared temples with local deities, creating a unique religious synthesis that reflected the city's cosmopolitan character. The city's prosperity attracted artisans, scholars, and merchants from across the empire. Workshops produced everything from fine pottery to intricate jewellery, much of which was exported to other parts of Gaul and beyond. The famous schools of Luteicia became renowned throughout the Roman world for their excellence in rhetoric, philosophy, and law. Young men from wealthy families across Gaul came to study here, creating an intellectual atmosphere that would influence the city's character for generations. By the 3rd century CE, however, cracks were beginning to appear in the Roman Empire's foundations. Economic troubles, political instability, and increasing pressure from barbarian tribes along the frontiers put enormous strain on the imperial system. Luteicia, despite its prosperity, couldn't escape these larger problems. The first major crisis came in 275 CE, when Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and invaded Gaul. The barbarian invasion of 275 was a wake-up call for the citizens of Luteicia. For the first time in over 2 centuries, their city faced the real possibility of destruction. The Romans hastily constructed defensive walls around the Ile de la Cité, abandoning the larger settlement on the left bank. This marked a significant shift in the city's geography and character. No longer would it sprawl confidently across both banks of the Seine. Instead, it would huddle defensively on its original island, much as the Celtic Parisian had done centuries earlier. The walls built during this crisis would define Paris for the next 1,000 years. Constructed from stone salvaged from abandoned Roman buildings, these fortifications turned the Ile de la Cité into an almost impregnable fortress. The island could only be approached by heavily defended bridges, making it nearly impossible for enemies to capture. This defensive strategy worked, and Luteicia survived the barbarian raids that devastated many other Gallic cities. Gallic cities. The transformation of Luteicia during this period of crisis reveals something fundamental about the character of this place. When faced with existential threats, the city didn't simply collapse or fade away. Instead, it adapted, evolved, and found new ways to survive and even thrive. This resilience would become one of Paris's defining characteristics throughout its long history. The late Roman period saw the rise of a new force that would reshape not just Luteicia, but all of Western Europe. Christianity had been spreading throughout the empire since the 1st century, but it wasn't until the 4th century that it truly took hold in Gaul. The story of how Luteicia became a Christian city is both fascinating and emblematic of the broader transformation taking place across the Roman world. Saint Denis, the first bishop of Paris, arrived in the city around 250 CE. According to legend, he was sent by Pope Fabian to convert the pagan inhabitants of Luteicia to Christianity. Denis faced enormous challenges in this mission. The Romans were tolerant of many religions, but Christianity's exclusive claims and rejection of traditional gods made it particularly threatening to the established order. Denis preached in secret, converting small groups of believers who met in hidden locations throughout the city. The persecution of Christians under Emperor Decius in 250 CE proved fatal for Denis and his companions. They were arrested, tortured, and finally beheaded on a hill north of the city. But according to Christian tradition, Denis performed one final miracle after his execution. He picked up his severed head and walked several miles while preaching a sermon about repentance. The hill where he was martyred became known as Montmartre, the Mount of Martyrs, and the place where he finally collapsed became the site of the Basilica of Saint-Denis. While this story contains obvious legendary elements, the impact of Denis' martyrdom on the early Christian community in Luteicia was very real. His death transformed him into a powerful symbol of faith and resistance against oppression. Secret Christian communities continued to grow throughout the 3rd and 4th centuries, even as official persecution continued. These early Christians developed a strong sense of community and shared purpose that would prove crucial during the chaotic centuries to come. The conversion of Emperor Constantine to Christianity in the early 4th century changed everything. Suddenly, Christianity wasn't just tolerated, but actively promoted throughout the empire. In Luteicia, this meant that Christian communities could emerge from the shadows and begin constructing proper churches. The first major Christian structure was built on the site where St. Denis had preached, establishing a tradition of sacred architecture that would culminate centuries later in the construction of Notre Dame Cathedral. The Christianization of Luteicia coincided with another major transformation in the city's political status. During the late Roman period, the city became increasingly important as an administrative centre for northern Gaul. Roman governors found that Luteicia's strategic location made it an ideal base for managing the turbulent frontier regions along the Rhine. The city's population grew as bureaucrats, soldiers, and merchants flocked to take advantage of new opportunities. Emperor Julian, known to history as Julian the Apostate, spent the winter of 357 to 358 CE in Luteicia and fell in love with the city. In his writings, he described it as his dear Luteicia and praised its mild climate, clear river, and beautiful surroundings. Julian's residence in the city marked the high point of Luteicia's importance in the late Roman Empire. For a brief moment, this city on the Seine served as an unofficial capital of northern Europe. Julian's description of 4th century Luteicia provides us with a vivid picture of urban life during this crucial period. He wrote about the city's excellent wine, produced from vineyards on the surrounding hills. He praised the quality of the local craftsmen and the sophistication of the city's schools. Most importantly, he noted the harmony between the city's diverse inhabitants, remarking that Romans, Gauls, and Germanic settlers all seemed to live together peacefully. This cosmopolitan atmosphere wasn't just a matter of imperial policy, but reflected genuine cultural exchange. Latin remained the language of government and educated discourse, but Celtic languages continued to be spoken in the streets and markets. Germanic dialects could be heard in the quarters where barbarian federati, allied troops, lived with their families. This linguistic diversity created a rich cultural environment where stories, songs, and traditions from across Europe mingled and influenced each other. The economic life of late Roman Luteicia was equally diverse and sophisticated. The city served as a major trading hub, connecting the Mediterranean world with the resources of northern Europe. Amber from the Baltic, furs from the Germanic forests, and wine from southern Gaul all passed through Luteicia's markets. Local craftsmen produced goods that were exported throughout the empire, from fine textiles to intricate metalwork. The city's workshops became famous for their production of luxury items that combined Roman techniques with Celtic artistic traditions. Jewelers created elaborate brooches and torques that blended classical motifs with abstract Celtic designs. Potters developed new glazing techniques that produced pottery prized throughout Gaul. These artisans weren't just copying Roman models, but creating something genuinely new and distinctively local. Education flourished in late Roman Luteicia as well. The city's schools attracted students from across northern Europe who came to study rhetoric, law, and philosophy. These institutions weren't just training grounds for imperial bureaucrats, but genuine centres of learning where intellectual traditions from across the classical world were preserved and transmitted. Many of the great scholars and writers of the late imperial period spent time in Luteicia, contributing to its reputation as a centre of learning. The religious life of the city became increasingly complex as Christianity grew alongside traditional Roman and Celtic beliefs. While Christianity was gaining official support, it took centuries for it to completely replace older religious practices. Temples to Roman gods continued to operate alongside Christian churches. Celtic sacred sites in the surrounding forests remained important pilgrimage destinations. This religious diversity created a uniquely tolerant atmosphere that would influence the city's character for centuries to come. However, this golden age of late Roman Luteicia couldn't last forever. By the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was facing a crisis that would ultimately prove fatal. barbarian tribes were pressing against the frontiers with increasing force, while internal political conflicts weakened the empire's ability to respond effectively. The Visigoths, Vandals, and other Germanic peoples were no longer content to serve as allied troops, but demanded territories of their own within the empire. The sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 CE sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world. If the Eternal City itself could fall to barbarian armies, what hope did provincial centres like Luteicia have? The psychological impact of Rome's fall was perhaps even more devastating than its military consequences. For centuries, Roman civilization had seemed invincible, but now that illusion was shattered forever. In Luteicia, the news of Rome's fall prompted both panic and preparation. The city's leaders strengthened the fortifications on the Ile de la Cité and stockpiled food and weapons for a potential siege. More importantly, they began reaching out to the various barbarian groups in the region, seeking to negotiate alliances that might protect the city from destruction. This pragmatic approach to dealing with the changing political landscape would prove crucial in the years to come. The Huns under Attila posed the next major threat to Gaul and to Luteicia specifically. In 451 CE, Attila's massive army swept across the Rhine and began devastating the cities of northern Gaul. Unlike previous barbarian invasions that had been primarily raids for plunder, this was a systematic campaign of conquest that threatened to destroy Roman civilization in Gaul entirely. The fate of Luteicia, and indeed all of northern Europe, hung in the balance. It was at this crucial moment that a remarkable woman emerged to save the city. Geneviève, a young Christian virgin who had dedicated her life to prayer and charitable works, became the unlikely leader of Luteicia's resistance to the Hun invasion. When panic gripped the city and many wanted to flee, Geneviève rallied the population. With her courage and faith, she organized prayer vigils and convinced the citizens to trust in divine protection rather than abandon their homes. According to tradition, Geneviève's prayers were answered when Attila's army mysteriously changed course and bypassed Luteicia entirely. Whether this was due to divine intervention, strategic considerations, or simple luck, the result was the same. The city survived while many others fell to the Huns. Geneviève's role in saving Luteicia made her a beloved figure who would later be recognized as the patron saint of Paris. The Hun crisis marked the beginning of the end for Roman rule in Gaul. The empire's authority was crumbling, and new powers were rising to fill the vacuum. The Franks, a confederation of Germanic tribes, had been slowly expanding their territory in northern Gaul for decades. Unlike other barbarian groups who came as conquerors and destroyers, the Franks showed a remarkable ability to adapt to and preserve Roman institutions while adding their own cultural elements. The Frankish king Clovis I would prove to be the most significant figure in the transition from Roman Luteicia to Frankish Paris. When Clovis came to power in 481 CE, he inherited a kingdom that was still relatively small and fragmented. But this young ruler possessed both military genius and political cunning that would transform not just his own realm, but the entire future of what would become France. His relationship with Luteicia would be crucial to this transformation. Clovis understood that controlling Luteicia meant controlling northern Gaul. The city's strategic position on the Seine made it the key to dominating trade routes and communication lines throughout the region. More importantly, Luteicia had managed to preserve much of its Roman infrastructure and administrative expertise during the chaotic 5th century. This made it an invaluable prize for any ruler seeking to establish lasting authority over the former Roman territories. The Frankish conquest of Luteicia wasn't achieved through a dramatic siege or battle. Instead, Clovis employed a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and strategic alliances to gradually extend his influence over the city. The local Roman administrators recognizing that the old imperial system was never coming back, chose to accommodate the new Frankish reality rather than resist it. This pragmatic approach allowed for a remarkably smooth transition that preserved much of the city's existing structure and culture. Clovis made a decision that would echo through history when he chose to make Luteicia his primary residence and the de facto capital of his expanding kingdom. This wasn't just a matter of convenience, but a deliberate strategy to legitimize his rule by associating it with the city's Roman heritage. By ruling from Luteicia, Clovis positioned himself as the heir to Roman authority in Gaul rather than simply another barbarian chieftain. The most momentous event of Clovis's reign took place not on a battlefield, but in a baptismal pool. Around 496 CE, Clovis converted to Catholic Christianity, becoming the first Germanic king to embrace the Orthodox faith rather than Arianism. This conversion was partly influenced by his wife Clotilde, a Burgundian princess who was already Catholic, but it was also a calculated political move designed to win the support of the Gallo-Roman population. The baptism of Clovis transformed the religious landscape of Luteicia and the surrounding region. Suddenly, the Frankish rulers and the Roman Catholic population shared the same faith, creating a bond that transcended ethnic and cultural differences. Churches that had been built during the late Roman period experienced a renaissance as Frankish nobles competed to demonstrate their piety through generous donations and elaborate building projects. Saint Geneviève lived to see this transformation and became a trusted advisor to Clovis. Her influence helped ensure that the transition from Roman to Frankish rule preserved the Christian character of the city while adapting it to new political realities. When Geneviève died around 502 CE, her funeral became a massive public ceremony that demonstrated the unity between Frankish rulers and Gallo-Roman citizens under the banner of Catholic Christianity. The early 6th century marked the true beginning of Paris as we know it today. Under Frankish rule, the city's name gradually shifted from Luteicia to Paris, honouring the Celtic Parisian who had first established a settlement on the island. This wasn't just a cosmetic change, but reflected a deeper transformation in the city's identity. Paris was becoming something new, a fusion of Celtic heritage, Roman infrastructure, Germanic political traditions, and Christian faith. Frankish Paris expanded beyond the confines of the Ile de la Cité for the first time since the barbarian invasions of the 3rd century. The left bank, which had been largely abandoned during the late Roman period, began to see new construction as churches and monasteries were established there. The right bank remained largely rural, but scattered settlements began to appear as craftsmen and merchants sought to take advantage of the city's growing prosperity. The Merovingian dynasty, descended from Clovis, made Paris their most important city, though they maintained a somewhat nomadic court that moved between various royal residences. This period saw the construction of numerous churches and religious foundations that would shape the city's landscape for centuries to come. The Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés was founded on the left bank, while the Church of Saint-Étienne, predecessor to Notre-Dame, was built on the Ile de la Cité. Merovingian Paris became a centre of learning and culture that preserved and transmitted the intellectual heritage of the classical world. Monasteries served as libraries and schools, where monks painstakingly copied ancient texts, ensuring their survival through the turbulent centuries ahead. The fusion of Germanic oral traditions with Latin literary culture created a rich intellectual environment that would influence European thought for generations. The city's economic life flourished under Frankish rule as well. Paris became a major stop on trade routes connecting the Mediterranean with northern Europe and the British Isles. The Seine provided easy access to the sea, while Roman roads that had been maintained and improved allowed overland commerce to thrive. Markets on both the island and the banks of the river buzzed with activity as merchants from across the known world gathered to buy and sell goods. However, the Merovingian period also revealed the challenges that would plague medieval Paris for centuries to come. The Frankish kingdom was frequently divided among multiple heirs, leading to civil wars that disrupted trade and threatened the city's prosperity. The concept of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited everything, hadn't yet been established, so royal deaths often triggered succession crises that could last for years. The most serious threat came in the late 7th and early 8th centuries, when the Merovingian dynasty began to weaken. Real power increasingly shifted to the mayors of the palace, court officials who managed the royal household and gradually assumed control over the kingdom's administration. This period of political instability coincided with a new external threat that would test Paris's resilience once again. The rise of Islam in the 7th century had created a new empire that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. By the early 8th century, Muslim armies had conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula and were pushing across the Pyrenees into Gaul itself. The prospect of Islamic conquest posed a fundamental challenge not just to Frankish political control, but to the Christian identity that had become central to Paris's character. The Battle of Tours in 732 CE, where Charles Martel defeated a Muslim army, is often portrayed as saving Christian Europe from Islamic conquest. While this battle was certainly important, its significance for Paris was more complex. The Muslim advance had already been slowing due to overextended supply lines and internal conflicts within the Islamic world. More importantly for Parisians, the victory at Tours confirmed the rising power of the Carolingian family, who would soon replace the declining Merovingians as rulers of the Frankish kingdom. Charles Martel's son, Pepin the Short, formally ended Merovingian rule in 751 CE and established the Carolingian dynasty. This transition was accomplished with a remarkable smoothness, partly because the Merovingians had become so weak that their removal seemed almost inevitable. For Paris, the change of dynasty meant a period of renewed stability and prosperity under rulers who appreciated the city's strategic and symbolic importance. The most famous Carolingian ruler, Charlemagne, transformed Paris's role within his vast empire. When Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope in 800 CE, Paris found itself at the heart of a political entity that stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube. This wasn't just a restoration of the Roman Empire, but something entirely new, a Christian empire that combined Germanic political traditions with Roman administrative practices and Catholic religious authority. Charlemagne established his primary capital at Aachen, but Paris remained one of the most important cities in his realm. The emperor frequently held court there, and the city became a major administrative centre for the northwestern regions of the empire. Charlemagne's palace on the Ile de la Cité was expanded and beautified, creating a complex of buildings that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe. The Carolingian period brought a cultural renaissance to Paris that historians call the Carolingian Renaissance. Schools attached to churches and monasteries flourished as Charlemagne promoted education and learning throughout his empire. The Palace School in Paris attracted scholars from across Europe who worked to preserve and copy ancient texts, while also creating new works of theology, history, and literature. This intellectual revival had profound implications for Paris's future development. The city became known throughout Europe as a centre of learning where the best teachers could be found and the most important texts were preserved. Students began travelling to Paris from distant lands, establishing a tradition of international scholarship that would eventually lead to the founding of the University of Paris in the 12th century. The economic prosperity of Carolingian Paris was equally impressive. The city's position at the heart of Charlemagne's empire made it a natural hub for trade and commerce. Merchants from Italy brought silk and spices from the east, while traders from the Baltic offered amber and furs. The famous fairs of Champagne, which would later become crucial to European commerce, had their origins in the trading networks that centered on Carolingian Paris. The city's craftsmen developed new techniques and styles that reflected its position at the crossroads of European culture. Goldsmiths created elaborate religious objects that combined Germanic animal motifs with classical proportions and Christian symbolism. Manuscript illuminators developed distinctive styles that influenced artistic development throughout the empire. These weren't just local craftsmen serving local needs, but artists whose work was sought after by collectors across Europe. However, the golden age of Carolingian Paris couldn't last forever. The empire that Charlemagne had built was too large and diverse to be governed effectively by the administrative systems of the early medieval period. When Charlemagne died in 814 CE, his son Louis the Pious struggled to maintain unity among the various ethnic and regional groups that made up the empire. The crisis came to a head with the Treaty of Verdun in 843 CE, which divided Charlemagne's empire among his three grandsons. Paris found itself in the western portion, which became the foundation of what would eventually become France. This division marked the beginning of a new chapter in the city's history, one that would see it emerge not just as an important regional centre, but as the capital of a distinct national identity. The Viking raids that began in the mid-9th century posed the most serious external threat that Paris had faced since the Hun invasions 4 centuries earlier. These weren't just random attacks by barbarian raiders, but systematic campaigns of conquest and colonization by sophisticated maritime peoples who understood how to exploit the political weaknesses of the Carolingian kingdoms. The first Viking attack on Paris came in 845 CE when a fleet of longships sailed up the Seine and demanded tribute from the city. The local authorities, lacking adequate military forces to resist, paid the Vikings to leave peacefully. This payment, while avoiding immediate destruction, established a dangerous precedent that encouraged further attacks in subsequent years. The most famous Viking siege of Paris took place from 885 to 886 CE, when a massive Viking fleet attempted to capture the city and use it as a base for conquering the surrounding region. This siege would test everything that Parisians had learned about survival and resistance over the previous 6 centuries, and its outcome would determine whether the city would continue to exist as an independent centre of Christian civilization or become just another Viking stronghold. The Great Siege of 885 revealed both the vulnerability and the remarkable resilience that had come to define Paris over the centuries. When hundreds of Viking longships appeared on the Seine, their dragon prows cutting through the morning mist, the sight must have been terrifying for the city's inhabitants. Yet this wasn't the first time Paris had faced existential threats, and the lessons learned from previous crises would prove invaluable in the desperate months ahead. The Vikings who attacked Paris weren't the savage raiders of popular imagination, but skilled warriors and sailors who had developed sophisticated military tactics through decades of campaigning across Europe. They understood siege warfare, possessed advanced naval technology, and had already conquered major cities throughout England, Ireland, and northern France. Their leader, Siegfried, commanded a fleet estimated at over 700 vessels, carrying perhaps 40,000 warriors, making this one of the largest military expeditions of the early medieval period. Count Odo of Paris emerged as the unlikely hero of this crisis. Unlike many nobles of his era, who preferred the safety of their country estates when danger threatened, Odo chose to remain in the city and organize its defense. He understood that Paris represented something more than just another prize for Viking raiders. This was a symbol of Christian resistance against pagan conquest, a beacon of civilization that had survived Roman collapse, barbarian invasions, and countless other challenges over the centuries. The siege began with the Vikings attempting to force their way past the fortified bridges that connected the Ile de la Cité to both banks of the Seine. These bridges weren't just transportation links, but crucial defensive positions that controlled access to the heart of the city. The Parisians had learned from previous attacks and strengthened these choke points with wooden towers, iron chains, and carefully positioned obstacles that could sink approaching vessels. For months, the siege continued, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Vikings launched assault after assault against the city's walls, using everything from scaling ladders to primitive siege engines. The defenders responded with arrows, boiling oil, and stones hurled from the ramparts. The narrow confines of the island meant that every building became a potential fortress, every street a battlefield where desperate hand-to-hand combat determined who would live and who would die. The psychological warfare was as intense as the physical fighting. The Vikings deliberately displayed their captives and plunder from other conquered cities, hoping to break the morale of the defenders. They performed elaborate pagan rituals within sight of the city walls, sacrificing prisoners to their gods, while chanting war songs that could be heard throughout Paris. For the Christian inhabitants, this wasn't just a military conflict, but a spiritual battle between their faith and the dark forces of heathen barbarism. Winter brought new challenges for both sides. The Vikings, accustomed to raiding and then returning to their bases, found themselves trapped by their own success. They controlled the surrounding countryside, but couldn't capture the island itself, leaving them in an uncomfortable stalemate. Meanwhile, the Parisians faced the prospect of starvation as their food supplies dwindled and no relief seemed forthcoming from the Carolingian king. The siege finally ended, not through military victory, but through negotiation and political maneuvering. King Charles the Fat arrived with an army, but chose to pay the Vikings to leave rather than risk a costly battle. This decision outraged many Parisians who felt betrayed after their heroic resistance, but it also demonstrated the complex political realities of the late Carolingian period. The central government was too weak to provide reliable protection, forcing local leaders to take responsibility for their own survival. Count Odo's leadership during the siege made him a hero throughout the Frankish kingdom and eventually led to his election as king when the Carolingian dynasty finally collapsed. This marked a crucial turning point in French history as political power shifted from the descendants of Charlemagne to a new dynasty that would eventually become the Capetians. Paris had not just survived the Viking threat, but had produced the leaders who would shape the future of France. The late 9th and early 10th centuries saw Paris gradually emerge as the most important city in what was becoming France. The Carolingian Empire had fragmented into numerous smaller kingdoms and duchies, but Paris remained a constant centre of power and culture that attracted ambitious nobles, talented clergy, and enterprising merchants. The city's survival of the Viking siege had enhanced its reputation throughout Europe as a place where Christian civilization could successfully defend itself against any threat. The founding of the Capetian dynasty in 987 CE marked the true beginning of Paris as the capital of France. Hugh Capet, whose family had risen to prominence through their defense of Paris against Viking attacks, established his court on the Ile de la Cité and began the process of transforming a regional power centre into the heart of a unified kingdom. This wasn't accomplished overnight, but represented the culmination of centuries of political, cultural, and economic development. The early Capetian kings understood that their legitimacy depended partly on their association with Paris and its history. They deliberately emphasized their role as protectors of the city's churches and monasteries, patrons of its schools and scholars, and guardians of its commercial prosperity. This created a symbiotic relationship between the monarchy and the city that would define French political culture for the next 8 centuries. Paris, in the early 11th century, was a city of perhaps 25,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest urban centres in northern Europe. The population was concentrated on the Ile de la Cité and the left bank, with the right bank still largely given over to fields, vineyards, and scattered settlements. The city's economy was based on a combination of royal administration, ecclesiastical activities, and long-distance trade that connected the Atlantic world with the Mediterranean and beyond. The religious life of the city became increasingly elaborate during this period. The Cathedral of Saint-Étienne on the Ile de la Cité was expanded and beautified, while new churches were founded on both banks of the Seine. Monasteries attracted donations from across the kingdom, allowing them to become major landowners and economic powers in their own right. The Abbey of Saint-Denis, just north of the city, became the traditional burial place of French kings and a symbol of the sacred character of royal authority. The intellectual renaissance that began during the Carolingian period reached new heights in 11th century Paris. The Cathedral School of Notre Dame became famous throughout Europe for its teaching of theology, philosophy, and the liberal arts. Students travelled from England, Germany, Italy, and Spain to study with the renowned masters who taught there. This international character gave Paris a cosmopolitan atmosphere that distinguished it from other medieval cities. Peter Abelard, perhaps the most famous teacher of this period, exemplified both the intellectual brilliance and the controversies that characterized Parisian academic life. His innovative approaches to theology and philosophy attracted students from across Europe, while his romantic relationship with Héloïse scandalized conservative clergy. The passionate letters exchanged between Abelard and Héloïse after their forced separation became literary classics that influenced European concepts of romantic love for centuries. The economic foundation of medieval Paris was remarkably diverse and sophisticated. The city served as a crucial link in trade networks that stretched from England to Constantinople and from Scandinavia to North Africa. The Seine provided easy access to the sea for ocean-going vessels, while the Roman road system, maintained and improved over the centuries, allowed overland commerce to flourish. Markets on the right bank attracted merchants from throughout the known world. The famous Lendit Fair, held annually in the fields north of Paris, became one of the most important commercial gatherings in medieval Europe. For several weeks each year, the area around Saint-Denis was transformed into a vast marketplace where merchants displayed goods from every corner of the continent. English wool, Flemish cloth, German silver, Italian silk, and Eastern spices all changed hands in transactions that involved enormous sums of money and established commercial relationships that lasted for generations. Parisian craftsmen developed specializations that made their products sought after throughout Europe. The city's goldsmiths created religious objects of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication. Manuscript illuminators developed distinctive styles that influenced artistic development across the continent. Architects and stonemasons pioneered new building techniques that would eventually revolutionize church construction throughout the medieval world. The 12th century brought unprecedented growth and prosperity to Paris. The population doubled, reaching perhaps 50,000 inhabitants by 1200. This growth was driven partly by natural increase, but mainly by immigration from the surrounding countryside, as peasants sought better opportunities in the expanding city. The urban economy could support far more people than agriculture alone, creating a magnet effect that drew ambitious individuals from across the kingdom. King Louis VI and his successor, Louis VII, undertook ambitious building projects that transformed the physical appearance of Paris. The royal palace on the Ile de la Cité was expanded and modernized, while new churches and public buildings demonstrated the growing wealth and confidence of the monarchy. The famous covered market known as the Halles was constructed on the right bank, creating a permanent centre for food distribution that would serve the city for over 800 years. The most ambitious project of this period was the construction of a new cathedral to replace the ageing church of Saint-Étienne. Bishop Maurice de Sully conceived of a building that would surpass anything previously constructed in France. a monument that would demonstrate Paris's position as the premier city of Christendom. Work began on Notre Dame Cathedral in 1163, marking the beginning of a construction project that would take nearly 2 centuries to complete. Notre Dame represented more than just an architectural achievement. It embodied the confidence, ambition, and artistic sophistication of medieval Paris at its height. The cathedral's innovative Gothic style, with its soaring arches, flying buttresses, and vast windows filled with coloured glass, created an entirely new aesthetic that would influence church architecture throughout Europe. The building served not just as a place of worship, but as a symbol of Parisian identity and achievement. The construction of Notre Dame required the cooperation of virtually every segment of Parisian society. The monarchy provided financial support and political backing, while the church hierarchy organised the project and recruited the necessary craftsmen. Merchants and guild members contributed both money and materials, while ordinary citizens donated their labour during slack periods in the agricultural calendar. This collective effort created a sense of shared purpose that strengthened social bonds across class lines. The cathedral also served as a catalyst for urban development on both sides of the Seine. The need for stone, timber, and other building materials created new industries and trade relationships. The presence of hundreds of skilled craftsmen working on the project attracted other artisans who established workshops in the surrounding area. The cathedral schools drew students and teachers who required housing, food, and other services, further stimulating economic growth. By the late 12th century, Paris had become widely recognized as the intellectual capital of Europe. The schools that had grown up around the cathedral and various monasteries were attracting thousands of students from every corner of Christendom. These students brought with them not just tuition fees, but new ideas, cultural traditions, and commercial connections that enriched the city's already cosmopolitan atmosphere. The emergence of the University of Paris in the early 13th century formalized this intellectual preeminence. Unlike other medieval universities that focused primarily on law or medicine, Paris became famous for its teaching of theology and philosophy. The greatest minds of the age gathered there to debate fundamental questions about the nature of God, the structure of the universe, and humanity's place in creation. Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great, and other luminaries of medieval thought spent crucial years teaching and writing in Paris. Their works, produced in the city's schools and copied in its scriptoriums, spread throughout Europe and influenced intellectual development for centuries. Paris wasn't just preserving ancient wisdom, but creating new knowledge that advanced human understanding of both natural and supernatural realms. The university also had profound economic and social effects on the city. Thousands of students required housing, food, books, and other necessities, creating a service economy that employed many Parisians. The international character of the student body brought foreign currencies, languages, and customs into daily life in the Latin Quarter. Wealthy students from noble families contributed to the luxury trades, while poorer scholars created a demand for cheap lodging and simple fare. The relationship between town and gown wasn't always harmonious. Students, many of them young men, far from home for the first time, frequently clashed with local merchants, craftsmen, and authorities. These conflicts sometimes escalated into serious riots that required royal intervention. Nevertheless, both sides recognized their mutual dependence, and arrangements were gradually worked out that protected the interests of both the academic and commercial communities. The reign of Philip Augustus marked a new phase in Paris's development as the capital of an increasingly powerful kingdom. This energetic monarch undertook massive construction projects that transformed both the appearance and the defensive capabilities of the city. Most importantly, he ordered the construction of a new wall that enclosed not just the original island, but substantial areas on both banks of the Seine. The wall built by Philip Augustus represented a quantum leap in the city's size and ambitions. For the first time since the Roman period, Paris officially extended beyond the Ile de la Cité to encompass the growing settlements on both sides of the river. The right bank, which had remained largely rural throughout the early medieval period, was now formally incorporated into the urban area and began to develop rapidly as merchants and craftsmen established themselves there. Philip Augustus also ordered the paving of the main streets, a revolutionary improvement that made travel through the city faster, cleaner, and more pleasant. Before this time, Parisian streets had been muddy tracks that became nearly impassable during wet weather. The new paved roads not only improved daily life for residents, but also enhanced the city's commercial attractiveness by making it easier to transport goods to and from the markets. The king's most ambitious project was the construction of the Louvre, originally conceived as a fortress to protect the westerner approaches to the city. This massive structure, built just outside the new wall, demonstrated Philip Augustus's determination to make Paris impregnable against any future attacks. The Louvre also served as a symbol of royal power, its imposing towers visible from throughout the city as a reminder of monarchical authority. The early 13th century saw Paris emerge as the undisputed centre of Gothic architecture, a revolutionary style that originated in the Île-de-France region and spread throughout Europe. The completion of Notre Dame's nave coincided with the construction of Sainte-Chapelle, Louis IX's private chapel, designed to house the crown of thorns and other precious relics. These buildings demonstrated technical and artistic innovations that influenced church construction from England to Hungary. The Gothic style wasn't just about aesthetics, but represented a new understanding of engineering and mathematics that allowed builders to create structures of unprecedented height and lightness. The pointed arch, flying buttress, and ribbed vault distributed weight more efficiently than previous techniques, permitting the construction of walls that were essentially frameworks for enormous windows. This technological revolution was largely developed and perfected by architects and craftsmen working in Paris. The city's role as a centre of artistic innovation extended beyond architecture to include sculpture, painting, and the decorative arts. The workshops that supplied Notre Dame and other Parisian churches developed new techniques for carving stone, casting bronze, and creating stained glass windows. These innovations spread throughout Europe as craftsmen trained in Paris established workshops in other cities, carrying Parisian artistic traditions to distant lands. The economic prosperity that supported these artistic achievements was based on the city's position at the centre of an expanding commercial network. Paris had become the hub of trade routes that connected the Atlantic ports with the Mediterranean, the English Channel with the Alpine passes, and the prosperous cities of Flanders with the emerging markets of Eastern Europe. This central position generated enormous wealth that supported both royal ambitions and private luxury. The transformation of the right bank during the 13th century created new neighbourhoods with distinct characters and specialisations. The area around the Halles became the commercial heart of the city, where merchants from throughout Europe gathered to buy and sell goods. The Marais district attracted wealthy nobles who built elaborate townhouses surrounded by gardens and courtyards. Craftsmen organised themselves into guilds that controlled specific trades and established workshops in designated areas. Guild organisation provided structure and stability to Parisian economic life, while also creating opportunities for social advancement. Skilled craftsmen could rise through the ranks, from apprentice to journeyman to master, eventually establishing their own workshops and training the next generation. The guild system also provided social services for members, including care for widows and orphans, support during illness or disability, and proper burial for the deceased. The intellectual life of 13th century Paris reached heights that wouldn't be surpassed until the Renaissance. The University of Paris attracted not just students and teachers, but also the scribes, illuminators, and bookbinders who created the manuscripts that preserved and transmitted medieval learning. The city became the centre of European book production, with workshops producing everything from simple textbooks to elaborate illuminated Bibles that were masterpieces of medieval art. The presence of so many scholars and students created a market for new ideas and intellectual innovations. Aristotelian philosophy, recently translated from Arabic, was studied and debated in Parisian classrooms before spreading to other European universities. The synthesis of classical philosophy with Christian theology that characterized scholastic thought was largely accomplished by thinkers working in Paris. The city wasn't just preserving ancient wisdom, but creating new knowledge that would influence Western thought for centuries. The reign of Louis IX, later canonized as Saint Louis, marked the pinnacle of medieval Paris's political and cultural influence. This deeply religious king transformed the city into a showcase of Christian monarchy, building Sainte-Chapelle as a reliquary for the crown of thorns and other sacred objects acquired from the Byzantine Empire. The chapel's stunning stained glass windows, which seemed to dissolve the walls into pure light and colour, represented the highest achievement of medieval architectural art. Louis IX also established Paris as a centre of justice and royal administration. The Parlement de Paris, originally the King's Court, evolved into a permanent judicial body that heard appeals from throughout the kingdom. Legal scholars developed new procedures and principles that influenced the development of French law for centuries. The city's role as both a religious centre and a seat of secular justice enhanced its prestige throughout medieval Europe. The economic foundation of this cultural flowering was the expansion of international trade networks that made Paris one of the wealthiest cities in Europe. Italian bankers established branches there to finance commerce with Northern Europe. Flemish merchants brought fine cloth to exchange for French wine and grain. German traders carried silver and other metals through Parisian markets on their way to Mediterranean ports. This commercial activity generated the tax revenues that supported royal building projects and patronage of the arts. The social structure of 13th century Paris was complex and dynamic, offering opportunities for advancement that were rare in medieval society. Successful merchants could purchase patents of nobility, while talented clerics could rise to positions of great influence regardless of their humble origins. The university created a class of educated professionals who served in royal administration, church hierarchy, and legal institutions. Even skilled craftsmen could achieve prosperity and social recognition through guild membership and entrepreneurial success. However, this golden age of medieval Paris also contained the seeds of future challenges. The city's rapid growth strained infrastructure and created overcrowding that would become increasingly problematic. The concentration of wealth and power attracted ambitious nobles who sometimes challenged royal authority. The complex relationships between different social groups occasionally erupted into conflicts that threatened public order and economic prosperity. The late 13th century brought new external pressures as well. The expansion of royal power created tensions with neighbouring kingdoms and the papacy. The Crusades, which had initially brought glory and wealth to France, were becoming expensive failures that drained royal resources. Climate change was beginning to affect agricultural productivity, creating food shortages that particularly impacted urban populations dependent on rural supplies. Nevertheless, as the 14th century dawned, Paris stood at the height of its medieval achievement. With a population approaching 200,000, it was one of the largest cities in Europe and arguably the most influential. The completion of Notre Dame Cathedral had given the city one of the world's most magnificent buildings, while the University of Paris remained Europe's premier centre of learning. The royal court attracted nobles, artists and scholars, from throughout Christendom, making Paris a truly international capital. The city's influence extended far beyond its physical boundaries. Parisian architectural styles were being copied throughout Europe, from the cathedrals of England to the churches of Central Europe. Legal principles developed in Parisian courts influenced judicial systems across the continent. Philosophical and theological ideas debated in Parisian classrooms shaped intellectual development throughout Christendom. Paris had become not just the capital of France, but a cultural capital for all of medieval Europe. This extraordinary achievement was the result of centuries of gradual development that had transformed a small Celtic settlement into one of the world's great cities. The strategic location chosen by the Parisian had proven its value again and again as successive civilizations recognized the advantages of controlling this bend in the Seine. Roman engineering, Germanic political traditions, Christian spiritual values, and Frankish military prowess had all contributed to creating something greater than the sum of its parts. Yet even as Paris celebrated its medieval triumph, forces were already at work that would test the city's resilience once again. The 14th century would bring challenges that would make the Viking raids seem modest by comparison. War, plague, social upheaval, and political crisis would threaten everything that generations of Parisians had built. But the city that had survived so much would find new ways to adapt, evolve, and ultimately emerge stronger than ever before. The 14th century opened with Paris at the zenith of its medieval glory, but within decades the city would face a cascade of disasters that threatened to undo centuries of progress. The reign of Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair, had seemed to promise continued prosperity and expansion. This ambitious monarch extended French influence across Europe, while beautifying Paris with new buildings and monuments. Yet his policies also created tensions that would have devastating consequences for the city and kingdom. Philip's conflict with Pope Boniface VIII over taxation of church property escalated into a crisis that shook the foundations of medieval Christendom. When the king's agents arrested the Pope at Anagni in 1303, it demonstrated French power, but also triggered a papal response that would transform European politics. The election of a French pope, who moved the papal court to Avignon in 1309, seemed like a triumph for French diplomacy, but it also created new problems that would eventually contribute to the Great Schism. The Avignon papacy brought immediate benefits to Paris. Wealthy French clerics who had previously sent their revenues to Rome now kept them within the kingdom. The papal court's demand for luxury goods stimulated Parisian craftsmen and merchants. Artists and scholars flocked to serve both the royal court in Paris and the papal court in Avignon, creating an unprecedented concentration of talent in French territories. The city's goldsmiths, manuscript illuminators, and architects found themselves busier than ever before. However, this apparent prosperity masked underlying economic problems that were becoming increasingly serious. The expansion of royal administration required ever larger revenues, leading to new taxes that burdened both urban and rural populations. Debasement of the currency created inflation that particularly hurt those living on fixed incomes. Climate change was reducing agricultural productivity just as population growth was creating greater demand for food, setting the stage for future crises. The succession crisis that erupted after the death of the last direct Capetian king in 1328 revealed how precarious France's position had become. The accession of Philip VI, first of the Valois dynasty, was challenged by Edward III of England, who claimed the French throne through his mother, Isabella. This dynastic dispute would trigger the 100 Years' War, a conflict that would devastate France for over a century and test Paris's resilience to its limits. The war began almost casually with raids and skirmishes that seemed like extensions of the feudal conflicts that had plagued medieval Europe for centuries. Few could have imagined that this dispute would evolve into a total war that would revolutionize military tactics, transform political structures, and reshape the social order of both France and England. For Paris, the conflict would bring siege, occupation, and near destruction before ultimately contributing to the city's emergence as the capital of a unified nation-state. The early phases of the war went badly for France. The devastating defeats at Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356 demonstrated the superiority of English military tactics and shattered French confidence in their traditional methods of warfare. The capture of King John II at Poitiers was particularly shocking, as it left France without effective leadership during one of the most critical periods in its history. Paris found itself essentially governing the kingdom while trying to raise the enormous ransom demanded for the king's release. The Estates General, summoned in 1356 to address the crisis, revealed deep divisions within French society that had been masked by the prosperity of the previous century. The bourgeoisie of Paris, led by the merchant provost Etienne Marcel, demanded political reforms that would limit royal authority and increase urban influence in government. The nobility, weakened by military defeats, struggled to maintain their traditional dominance. The clergy found themselves caught between competing loyalties to king, pope, and people. Etienne Marcel's revolt in 1357 to 1358 marked a crucial moment in Parisian history. For the first time since the Viking invasions, the city's inhabitants took direct control of their own destiny, challenging both royal authority and noble privilege. Marcel's red and blue cap became a symbol of urban independence that would inspire later revolutionary movements. The revolt failed, and Marcel was assassinated, but the precedent had been set for popular resistance to unpopular government. The Jacquerie, the peasant uprising that coincided with Marcel's urban revolt, demonstrated that discontent wasn't limited to the cities. Rural populations, devastated by warfare and overtaxed to finance the war effort, erupted in spontaneous violence against their noble lords. The brutal suppression of these revolts temporarily restored order, but didn't address the underlying problems that had caused them. Paris remained a powder keg of social tensions waiting for the next spark. The return of King John II from English captivity in 1360 brought temporary stability, but at an enormous cost. The Treaty of Bretigny required France to pay a ransom of 3 million gold écus, equivalent to several years of royal revenue. Much of this burden fell on the cities, particularly Paris, which was forced to contribute both money and hostages to guarantee payment. The economic strain of this ransom would affect the city for decades. The resumption of warfare in 1369 brought new devastation to the Île-de-France region surrounding Paris. English and Allied forces, supported by the infamous Free Companies of Mercenaries, systematically ravaged the countryside, destroying crops, burning villages, and capturing anyone who might bring a ransom. These raiders often came within sight of Paris's walls, creating a climate of fear and uncertainty that undermined normal economic activity. The reign of Charles V, known as Charles the Wise, marked a gradual recovery of French fortunes. This scholarly king, who had witnessed the humiliations of his father's reign, developed new strategies that gradually drove the English forces back. He reformed royal administration, strengthened the kingdom's finances, and supported military innovations that restored French competitiveness on the battlefield. For Paris, his reign brought a welcome respite from the constant threat of attack. Charles V's patronage of learning and the arts maintained Paris's position as Europe's intellectual capital, despite the ongoing war. The Royal Library established in the Louvre became one of the largest collections of manuscripts in Europe. Scholars like Nicole Oresme made important contributions to mathematics, astronomy, and economic theory. The king's support for translation projects made classical and contemporary works available in French, contributing to the development of vernacular literature and learning. The construction of the Bastille fortress in the 1370s demonstrated both the continuing threats facing Paris and the royal commitment to defending the capital. This massive structure, built to guard the eastern approaches to the city, became a symbol of royal power and urban security. Its thick walls and deep moats were designed to withstand the most advanced siege techniques of the age, while its location allowed defenders to control access to the city from the surrounding countryside. Charles V also undertook extensive improvements to the existing city walls, adding new towers and strengthening weak points that had been identified during previous attacks. The fortifications of Paris became a model for other European cities, demonstrating the latest developments in military engineering. These defences would prove their worth in the desperate years ahead, when the city would face its greatest challenge since the Viking invasions. The sudden death of Charles V in 1380 plunged France back into crisis. His heir, Charles VI, was only 12 years old, creating a regency that unleashed factional conflicts among the great nobles. The Dukes of Anjou, Berry, Burgundy, and Bourbon competed for influence over the young king and control of royal resources. Paris became the centre of these power struggles, with different factions trying to win support among the city's merchants, craftsmen, and common people. The Regency period saw a resurgence of urban unrest as economic problems multiplied and political authority weakened. New taxes imposed to finance the ongoing war effort sparked riots in Paris and other cities. The Maillotins Revolt of 1382, named after the lead mallets that protesters used as weapons, demonstrated the explosive potential of popular anger when combined with political instability. The brutal suppression of this uprising temporarily restored order, but at the cost of further alienating the urban population. Charles VI's descent into madness beginning in 1392 created a political vacuum that rival factions rushed to fill. The struggle between the Armagnacs, led by the Duke of Orleans, and the Burgundians, headed by John the Fearless, tore France apart just when unity was most needed. Paris became a battleground between these factions, with control of the city changing hands repeatedly as each side tried to legitimize their authority by controlling the capital. The assassination of Louis of Orleans in 1407 on a Paris street marked the beginning of civil war within France. This murder, ordered by John the Fearless, transformed factional rivalry into blood feud and made compromise impossible. The streets of Paris became dangerous as armed retainers of rival nobles fought pitched battles while ordinary citizens tried to go about their daily lives. The city's prosperity, built up over centuries, began to crumble as trade declined and violence became commonplace. John the Fearless's control of Paris from 1409 to 1413 demonstrated the consequences of putting factional interests ahead of national unity. While the Duke presented himself as a reformer who would clean up royal administration and reduce taxes, his real goal was to use the capital's resources to support his struggle against the Armagnacs. The citizens of Paris found themselves trapped between competing claims to legitimacy, with each faction demanding their support while offering little in return. The Capetian Revolt of 1413 revealed the depth of social tensions that had been building in Paris for decades. Led by the butcher Simon Caboche, this uprising combined legitimate grievances about taxation and government corruption with xenophobic attacks on foreign merchants and royal officials. The rebels' demands for political reform attracted support from many respectable citizens, but their violent methods ultimately discredited their cause and led to their suppression. The return of Armagnac control to Paris later, in 1413, brought new repression and persecution as the victorious faction sought revenge against their opponents. Thousands of Burgundian supporters were arrested, executed, or forced to flee the city. This cycle of factional revenge weakened Paris's economic base and destroyed the social bonds that had held the urban community together. The city that had once been a model of medieval prosperity and culture was becoming a shadow of its former self. The English invasion of 1415 found France divided and weakened by decades of civil war. Henry V's victory at Agincourt was as much a result of French disunity as English military superiority. With the Armagnacs and Burgundians still fighting each other instead of the foreign invader, France lacked the coordinated resistance that had successfully expelled earlier English expeditions. Paris watched helplessly as English forces advanced through Normandy toward the capital. The Burgundian alliance with England in 1419, following the assassination of John the Fearless, created a nightmarish situation for Parisians. The Duke of Burgundy's son, Philip the Good, abandoned the French cause entirely and threw his support behind English claims to the French throne. This meant that Paris faced not just foreign conquest, but the prospect of being handed over to the enemy by French nobles who put their personal revenge ahead of patriotic duty. The English occupation of Paris, beginning in 1420, marked the lowest point in the city's medieval history. For the first time since the Roman conquest over a millennium earlier, foreign soldiers patrolled the streets of the French capital. The Treaty of Troyes, which designated Henry V as heir to the French throne, seemed to promise the complete extinction of French independence. Many Parisians, exhausted by decades of war and factional violence, initially welcomed the prospect of peace under English rule. The dual monarchy established by the Treaty of Troyes created a bizarre situation in which Paris served as the capital of both England and France simultaneously. English officials took over royal administration while trying to maintain the appearance of French continuity. The University of Paris was forced to recognize Henry V as the legitimate king of France, though many masters and students fled to areas still under French control. The city's churches held services for English victories while secretly praying for French deliverance. Henry V's sudden death in 1422 complicated the English position in France, just as their control seemed secure. The infant Henry VI could hardly provide the strong leadership needed to consolidate English conquests, while the Duke of Bedford, serving as regent, faced the enormous challenge of governing a hostile population with limited resources. Many Parisians began to hope that English rule might prove as temporary as previous foreign occupations. The emergence of Joan of Arc as a symbol of French resistance transformed the political and psychological landscape of the war. Her victories at Orléans and other cities demonstrated that the English could be defeated and that God might indeed favour the French cause. Even in occupied Paris, news of the Maid's successes spread quickly through underground networks, inspiring hope among those who had almost despaired of French independence. The attempted English coronation of Henry VI as King of France in Notre Dame Cathedral in 1431 was intended to legitimise English rule, but instead highlighted its weakness. The ceremony was poorly attended by French nobles, and many Parisians stayed away from the celebrations. The contrast with previous royal coronations at Reims Cathedral was stark, emphasising that this was a foreign imposition rather than a natural succession. Joan of Arc's capture and trial in English-controlled territory provided the occupiers with an opportunity to discredit French resistance by portraying it as heretical and demonic. Her execution in 1431 was celebrated by English officials and their French collaborators as proof that God supported their cause. However, many Parisians were shocked by the burning of a young woman whose only crime had been loyalty to France, and her martyrdom ultimately strengthened rather than weakened French resolve. The gradual French recovery began with the reconciliation between the Dauphin Charles and the Duke of Burgundy in 1435. The Treaty of Arras ended the civil war that had torn France apart for decades and united French forces against the English occupiers. This diplomatic revolution isolated the English in their remaining strongholds and made their position in Paris increasingly precarious. The French recapture of Paris in 1436 marked the beginning of the end of English power in France. The city's liberation was accomplished through a combination of internal revolt and external assault that demonstrated the fundamental weakness of foreign occupation. Parisians who had collaborated with the English fled or went into hiding, while those who had maintained their loyalty to France emerged to celebrate their deliverance. Charles VII's triumphant entry into his capital after 16 years of exile was an emotional moment that symbolised the renewal of French independence. The king's first act was to attend a Thanksgiving service at Notre Dame Cathedral, where he knelt before the altar to pray for the souls of those who had died defending France. This gesture of humility and remembrance helped heal some of the wounds left by decades of war and occupation. The liberation of Paris required extensive reconstruction and reform to repair the damage caused by years of conflict and foreign rule. Many buildings had been destroyed or allowed to fall into ruin. The city's walls needed repair and modernization to meet the challenges of new military technologies. Most importantly, the social fabric of the urban community had to be rewoven after the divisions and betrayals of the occupation period. Charles VII's administrative reforms helped restore effective government to Paris and France as a whole. The creation of a permanent royal army reduced the kingdom's dependence on unreliable feudal levies and mercenary companies. New tax systems provided steady revenues that could support both military forces and public works. The establishment of royal courts in Paris ensured that justice would be administered according to consistent principles rather than local customs. The economic recovery of Paris was remarkable given the devastation of the previous decades. The restoration of internal peace allowed trade routes to reopen and commerce to resume. Craftsmen returned to their workshops, while merchants re-established their networks throughout Europe. The city's markets once again bustled with activity as confidence in the future gradually returned. The cultural renaissance that followed the liberation demonstrated the resilience of Parisian intellectual life. The University of Paris, which had been reduced to a shadow of its former self during the English occupation, began to attract students and masters from across Europe once again. New colleges were founded, libraries were restocked with manuscripts, and scholarly debates resumed in the traditional schools of the Latin Quarter. The second half of the 15th century saw Paris emerge from the trauma of war and occupation, stronger and more unified than before. The shared experience of suffering under foreign rule had created a new sense of French national identity that transcended regional and class divisions. Parisians took pride in their role as citizens of the capital of a kingdom that had successfully resisted foreign conquest and internal division. The reign of Louis I brought further consolidation of royal power and urban prosperity. This cunning monarch, known as the Spider King for his intricate diplomatic webs, completed the process of unifying France under strong central authority. His support for commerce and industry benefited Paris directly, as the city became the hub of an expanding network of royal administration and economic activity. The introduction of printing to Paris in the 1470s marked a revolutionary moment in the city's intellectual history. The first printing press, established at the Sorbonne, began producing books that could spread knowledge far more quickly and cheaply than hand-copied manuscripts. Within decades, Paris had become one of Europe's major centres of book production, with dozens of printing shops serving both domestic and international markets. The growth of the printing industry transformed the Latin Quarter into a centre of intellectual commerce that attracted scholars, students, and book dealers from across Europe. The availability of printed books made education more accessible and affordable, leading to higher literacy rates and a broader reading public. This intellectual democratization would have profound implications for both religious and political thought in the centuries ahead. The late 15th century also saw significant architectural developments that reflected Paris's renewed prosperity and confidence. The completion of several church construction projects that had been interrupted by the war demonstrated the city's commitment to maintaining its position as a centre of Christian culture. New buildings combined traditional Gothic elements with Renaissance influences that were beginning to penetrate France from Italy. The royal court's growing sophistication attracted artists, musicians, and writers who contributed to a cultural flowering that rivaled the achievements of the 13th century. The development of vernacular literature in French created new forms of artistic expression that complemented the traditional Latin culture of the universities and churches. This cultural diversity reflected Paris's position at the crossroads of European civilization. As the 15th century drew to a close, Paris stood poised on the threshold of a new age. The city had survived the greatest crisis in its medieval history and emerged with renewed strength and purpose. The population, which had fallen to perhaps 50,000 during the darkest years of war and occupation, was growing rapidly as peace and prosperity returned. New neighbourhoods were developing beyond the medieval walls as the urban area expanded to accommodate an increasing numbers of residents. The French monarchy, strengthened by its victories over both foreign enemies and internal rivals, was ready to assert itself on the European stage with unprecedented ambition. The Italian wars that would dominate the early 16th century would bring new challenges and opportunities for Paris as the capital of an emerging great power. The city's merchants, craftsmen, and scholars would benefit from expanded horizons while also facing new forms of competition and cultural influence. The religious unity that had characterized medieval Paris was beginning to show signs of strain as new ideas about faith and authority spread through the printing presses and universities. The Protestant Reformation would soon divide Christendom and force Parisians to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between church, state, and individual conscience. These religious conflicts would test the city's tolerance and threaten its stability in ways that medieval Parisians could never have imagined. Yet the foundations laid during the medieval period provided Paris with resources and resilience that would serve it well in the challenging centuries ahead. The city's strategic location, diverse economy, intellectual traditions, and strong sense of identity had been tested by fire and proven durable. The small Celtic settlement that had once clung to an island in the Seine had evolved into one of Europe's great capitals, ready to play an even larger role in shaping the destiny of the continent and the world. The transformation of Paris during the early Renaissance period reflected broader changes sweeping across Europe as new ideas about art, politics, and human nature challenged medieval assumptions. The Italian wars that began in 1494 brought French armies into direct contact with Renaissance culture, and the returning soldiers, nobles, and administrators carried these influences back to Paris. The royal court, eager to compete with Italian magnificence, became a conduit for artistic innovations that would fundamentally alter the appearance and character of the capital. Francis I, who ascended to the throne in 1515, embodied this new Renaissance spirit with his passionate enthusiasm for learning, art, and architectural grandeur. This charismatic monarch spoke multiple languages, collected manuscripts and paintings, and surrounded himself with scholars and artists from across Europe. His vision for Paris extended far beyond mere political control, to encompass cultural leadership that would establish France as the equal of any Italian city-state in terms of artistic achievement and intellectual sophistication. The king's invitation to Leonardo da Vinci to spend his final years in France symbolized this cultural ambition. Although the great master lived at the chateau of Clos-Lucé near Amboise rather than in Paris itself, his presence in the kingdom attracted other Italian artists and scholars who recognized new opportunities in the French capital. These immigrants brought with them techniques, styles, and perspectives that enriched the existing artistic traditions while creating entirely new forms of expression. The reconstruction of the Louvre under Francis I marked the beginning of an architectural revolution that would transform the appearance of royal Paris. The medieval fortress built by Philip Augustus was gradually replaced with elegant Renaissance galleries and courtyards that reflected the latest developments in Italian design. Classical columns, symmetrical facades, and elaborate decorative programs created a new aesthetic that emphasized harmony, proportion, and humanistic values rather than the vertical aspiration and divine symbolism of Gothic architecture. Pierre Lescot, the French architect responsible for much of the Louvre's Renaissance transformation, successfully adapted Italian principles to French traditions and climate. His designs incorporated larger windows, steeper roofs, and more elaborate chimneys that were necessary for Northern European conditions, while maintaining the classical proportions and decorative vocabulary that characterized Renaissance style. This synthesis of Italian innovation with French practicality created a distinctive architectural language that would influence building throughout the kingdom. The patronage system that supported these artistic developments created new opportunities for both foreign immigrants and native Parisians. Wealthy nobles competed to commission paintings, sculptures, and decorative objects that would demonstrate their sophistication and cultural awareness. This demand supported workshops throughout the city, where master craftsmen trained apprentices in the latest techniques while adapting traditional skills to meet changing tastes and requirements. The school of Fontainebleau, though located outside Paris, had profound effects on artistic development within the capital. The Italian masters, brought to France by Francis I, established new standards for painting and decoration that influenced artists throughout the kingdom. Their works, featuring complex allegorical programs, sophisticated perspective, and refined technique, set new benchmarks for artistic achievement that Parisian artists strove to match and eventually surpass. The intellectual life of Renaissance Paris was equally dynamic and transformative. The arrival of Greek scholars fleeing the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople had enriched the university's curriculum with authentic classical texts and new approaches to ancient philosophy. Humanist scholars like Guillaume Boudet developed new methods of textual criticism and historical analysis that challenged medieval approaches to learning while opening up fresh perspectives on both classical and contemporary problems. The Collège de France, founded by Francis I in 1530, represented a direct challenge to the conservative curriculum of the traditional University of Paris. This new institution offered instruction in Greek, Hebrew, and mathematics according to humanist principles that emphasized critical thinking and empirical investigation rather than rote memorization of ancient authorities. The rivalry between the old and new approaches to learning created a vibrant intellectual atmosphere that attracted students and scholars from throughout Europe. The growth of printing in Paris accelerated the spread of Renaissance ideas while also creating new forms of cultural expression. By the mid-16th century, the city had become one of Europe's major publishing centres, producing books in Latin, French, Greek, and Hebrew for both scholarly and popular audiences. The availability of relatively inexpensive printed books democratized learning and made possible the emergence of a literate public that could engage with complex ideas about religion, politics, and philosophy. Vernacular literature flourished in this environment as French writers developed new forms of poetry, drama, and prose that rivaled anything being produced in Italy or other European cultural centres. The Pléiades, a group of poets led by Pierre de Ronsard and Joachim du Bellay, consciously set out to create a French literary language that could express the full range of human experience with the same elegance and sophistication as classical Latin and Greek. Their success in this endeavour established French as a major European literary language and enhanced Paris's reputation as a centre of cultural innovation. The religious upheavals of the 16th century posed unprecedented challenges to the traditional unity of Parisian society. The Protestant Reformation, which began in Germany but quickly spread throughout Europe, found fertile ground among the educated classes who had been exposed to humanist ideas about individual conscience and religious authority. The printing presses that had spread Renaissance learning also disseminated Protestant texts that challenged fundamental Catholic doctrines and institutional practices. John Calvin's stay in Paris during the 1530s, though brief, had lasting consequences for the city's religious development. This brilliant theologian and future reformer of Geneva attracted followers among university students and humanist scholars who were drawn to his systematic approach to theology and his emphasis on predestination and divine sovereignty. Although Calvin was forced to flee France when his Protestant views became known, his ideas continued to spread through underground networks of believers. The growth of a Protestant community within traditionally Catholic Paris created tensions that would ultimately explode into open warfare. The Huguenots, as French Protestants came to be known, included many members of the educated middle class, skilled craftsmen, and even some nobles who found Protestant theology more compelling than traditional Catholic teaching. Their presence challenged not just religious orthodoxy, but also the social and political structures that depended on religious unity for legitimacy. King Henry II's aggressive campaign against Protestant heresy intensified these religious divisions, while failing to eliminate the underlying appeal of reformist ideas. The establishment of special courts to try religious offences and the public execution of Protestant leaders created martyrs whose deaths inspired rather than discouraged their followers. The spectacle of burnings at the Place de Grève became a source of division rather than unity, as some Parisians celebrated the punishment of heretics, while others were horrified by the persecution of fellow Christians. The accidental death of Henry II in a tournament in 1559 plunged France into a succession crisis that religious divisions made even more dangerous. The new king, Francis II, was only 15 years old and completely dominated by the ultra-Catholic Guise family, who used their influence to intensify persecution of Protestants while enriching themselves at royal expense. This polarisation of the court created opportunities for Protestant nobles to organise resistance while driving moderate Catholics toward more extreme positions. The short reign of Francis II ended with his death in 1560, bringing his 10-year-old brother Charles IX to the throne under the regency of their mother, Catherine de' Medici. This Italian princess, often misunderstood and maligned by contemporary historians, actually pursued a relatively moderate policy that sought to balance competing religious factions while preserving royal authority. Her efforts to find compromise solutions reflected both political pragmatism and genuine concern for the welfare of the kingdom. The Colloquy of Poissy in 1561, organised by Catherine de' Medici in an attempt to reconcile Catholic and Protestant theologians, demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of religious dialogue in 16th century France. The meeting brought together some of the most learned representatives of both faiths for serious discussions about fundamental theological differences. While no agreement was reached on doctrinal issues, The very fact that such discussions could take place suggested that peaceful coexistence might be possible. The failure of the colloquy to produce religious reconciliation led to increasingly desperate attempts to find political solutions to theological problems. The Edict of January 1562, which granted limited toleration to Protestant worship, represented a pragmatic compromise that satisfied neither side while creating new opportunities for conflict. Catholics viewed any concessions to heretics as betrayals of divine truth, while Protestants saw limited toleration as insufficient recognition of their legitimate rights. The massacre at Huassy in March 1562, where the Duke of Guise's soldiers killed Protestant worshippers, marked the beginning of the French Wars of Religion that would devastate the kingdom for the next 36 years. This incident transformed religious tensions into open warfare as both sides abandoned hope of peaceful resolution and prepared for armed conflict. Paris found itself at the centre of this struggle as the capital of a kingdom torn apart by irreconcilable differences about the most fundamental questions of human existence. The siege of Paris during the First War of Religion in 1562 gave the city's population their first taste of the horrors that religious conflict would bring. Protestant armies led by the Prince of Condé attempted to capture the capital and forced the royal government to grant full religious freedom. The siege failed, but not before causing significant hardship and demonstrating the vulnerability of even the kingdom's greatest city to the destructive forces that had been unleashed. The Peace of Amboise in 1563 temporarily ended the first phase of religious warfare, but solved none of the underlying problems that had caused it. The compromise granted limited rights to Protestant worship while maintaining Catholic supremacy in most areas of the kingdom. This arrangement satisfied no one and merely provided a breathing space for both sides to rearm and prepare for renewed conflict. In Paris, the uneasy peace was maintained by royal troops, while underground religious tensions continued to simmer. The Second and Third Wars of Religion in the late 1560s brought increasing polarization as moderate voices were drowned out by extremists on both sides. The Catholic League, organised by the Guise family, demanded the complete extirpation of heresy from France, while Protestant leaders called for full religious freedom and political autonomy. These irreconcilable demands made compromise increasingly difficult and set the stage for even more devastating conflicts. The marriage of the Protestant Henry of Navarre to the Catholic Marguerite de Valois in 1572 was intended to symbolise religious reconciliation and political unity. The wedding ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral brought together Protestant and Catholic nobles in an apparent celebration of tolerance and cooperation. However, the underlying tensions were too deep for any single ceremonial gesture to resolve, and the gathering of so many Protestant leaders in Paris actually created opportunities for their enemies to strike. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre that began on August 24, 1572, represented the most traumatic event in Paris's history since the Viking invasions. What started as a targeted assassination of Protestant leaders quickly escalated into a general slaughter that claimed thousands of lives throughout the capital. The violence was both spontaneous and organised, reflecting years of accumulated religious hatred that finally found expression in bloodshed. The massacre began with the murder of Admiral Coligny and other Protestant leaders who had remained in Paris after the royal wedding. Catholic extremists, possibly acting with royal approval, struck before dawn to eliminate the political and military leadership of French Protestantism. However, the killing quickly spread beyond its original targets as ordinary Parisians joined in the violence against their Protestant neighbours. For 3 days, the streets of Paris ran with blood as Catholics hunted down anyone suspected of Protestant sympathies. Entire families were murdered in their homes, while others were dragged from churches where they had sought sanctuary. The Seine became clogged with corpses as bodies were thrown from bridges and riverbanks. The horror was so complete that even some Catholics were sickened by the brutality they witnessed. The international reaction to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was swift and condemnatory. Protestant countries throughout Europe expressed outrage at the systematic murder of fellow believers, while even Catholic powers were disturbed by the scale and brutality of the violence. The massacre damaged France's reputation for centuries and created a legacy of mistrust that would influence European politics for generations. Within France, the massacre initially seemed to strengthen Catholic extremism by eliminating much of the Protestant leadership and terrorizing survivors into submission. Many Huguenots converted to Catholicism or fled the kingdom rather than risk further persecution. However, the long-term effects were more complex, as the brutality of the violence also shocked moderate Catholics who had previously supported anti-Protestant policies. The survivors of the massacre who remained in France developed new forms of organization and resistance that made them even more dangerous to their enemies. The Protestant political theory that emerged from this period justified resistance to tyrannical rulers and provided intellectual foundations for later revolutionary movements. The experience of persecution had transformed French Protestantism from a religious reform movement into a political opposition that challenged fundamental assumptions about royal authority and religious unity. Charles IX's death in 1574 brought his brother Henry III to the throne at a time when the kingdom seemed to be disintegrating under the pressure of religious conflict. The new king faced opposition from both Catholic extremists who considered him insufficiently committed to the faith and Protestant survivors who could never forgive his role in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. His attempts to find a middle course satisfied no one and gradually eroded royal authority throughout the kingdom. The formation of the Catholic League as an organised political movement in the 1580s represented a fundamental challenge to royal sovereignty. Led by Henry, Duke of Guise, the League demanded that the king enforce Catholic orthodoxy throughout the kingdom and exclude any Protestant from the royal succession. When Henry III proved unwilling or unable to meet these demands, the League began to organise independent military forces and establish parallel governmental structures. The Day of the Barricades in May 1588 demonstrated the League's power within Paris itself. When Henry III attempted to dismiss Guise from his position as governor of the city, Parisian Catholics erected barricades throughout the streets and forced the king to flee his own capital. This humiliation revealed the complete breakdown of royal authority and the emergence of popular religious movements that could challenge even monarchical power. Henry III's assassination of the Duke of Guise at the Château de Blois in December 1588 was intended to break the power of the Catholic League, but instead triggered a revolution that drove the king from his throne. The League's control of Paris became complete as radical preachers called for the deposition of a king who had murdered a defender of the faith. The city declared its independence from royal authority and established a revolutionary government that challenged the fundamental principles of French monarchy. The siege of Paris by Henry III and his Protestant ally Henry of Navarre in 1589 subjected the capital to the most severe hardships it had experienced since the 100 Years' War. The League's control of the city meant that its population was trapped between besieging royal forces and their own extremist leaders who preferred death to surrender. Food shortages became so severe that Parisians were reduced to eating grass, leather, and even human flesh to survive. The assassination of Henry III by the Dominican friar Jacques Clément in August 1589 eliminated the last Valois king and left Henry of Navarre as the legitimate heir to the French throne. However, the new king faced the enormous challenge of conquering his own kingdom, as the Catholic League controlled most major cities and refused to accept a Protestant ruler. The siege of Paris continued under new circumstances, as Henry IV attempted to claim his inheritance by force. The conversion of Henry IV to Catholicism in 1593 marked the beginning of the end of the French Wars of Religion. The king's famous declaration that Paris is well worth a mass reflected his pragmatic understanding that religious unity was essential for political stability. His conversion removed the League's primary justification for resistance and gradually won over moderate Catholics who had supported the rebellion primarily from religious motives. The surrender of Paris to Henry IV in March 1594 ended 16 years of League control and began the process of national reconciliation that would restore France to greatness. The king's triumphant entry into his capital was carefully orchestrated to demonstrate both his authority and his magnanimity toward former enemies. His decision to pardon most League supporters and restore their property showed his understanding that lasting peace required forgiveness rather than revenge. From a small island settlement defended by Celtic warriors to the gleaming capital of a unified nation, Paris had undergone one of history's most remarkable transformations. The city that began as Luteicia on the Seine had survived Roman conquest, barbarian invasions, Viking sieges, medieval plagues, foreign occupation, and religious civil wars to emerge as something far greater than its founders could have imagined. Through each crisis, Paris had demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for renewal and reinvention that would define its character for centuries to come. The foundations were now in place for the city to become not just the political centre of France, but the cultural heart of Europe itself.